It's an interesting topic, I think, one that we'll get into in a bit more detail, and Toby asked me what was it about. So in reality, I'll give you a quick spiel about what it's about and why it's important, and I'll go through, I guess, a problem and the sort of thing that we see happening across government, both in Australia, New Zealand and overseas as well, and talk about how Drupal can be part of this. A little bit about me. The EY Oceania Studio Plus leader. Studio Plus is a new concept at EY. It brings together, we bought 38 different companies, one of which was a company called Adelphi Digital. In Australia, there was about 7 companies that we acquired in the last 6 or 7 years. And all those companies were operating in some degree of silo, not necessarily always in a most coherent fashion. And Studio Plus is the concept to bring all our creative design, technology and marketing companies into one banner. So effectively now, all of our global companies that work working in a way where we work using consistent methods, where we work using an approach across all of those different parts of our business, where we work in a consolidated fashion. And we also do a lot more sharing now. So now globally I have access to 7,000 people who work in a similar space. We have some amazing clients. I'll talk briefly about some of them later on, about some of the work that we're doing internationally and things as well. But really at the heart of it, what we're trying to do is connect customers and citizens through technology into achieving goals. So actually making sure that what you're delivering is delivering at scale for millions and millions of users. So most of the projects we do are projects where we incorporate, for example, Drupal as a component of an overall solution. So a lot of the time we might have 10, 15 different products in the mix. We might have a huge amount of complexity in what we're trying to deliver. And sometimes that causes us some interesting drama. And that's what I'll talk about today. So I think just to put a little bit of broader context around it, at the moment, we're probably in the third age of digital transformation. For those that have been working in web and digital for a long, long time, and I've probably been 30 years in the industry now, if you remember back to the early 2000s, a lot of the time you could just go and build a website and people would say, that's amazing, they just wanted to get their products and services online and they just wanted to be like, oh, we're online, we have a site, like, awesome. And then obviously with the invention of the iPhone around 2007, the switch moved to kind of mobile and cloud and social, and the transition effectively became, how do you become multi-channel? How do you work across all the different channels that people engage with? And how do you, I guess, interact with your customers and clients and citizens in a way that makes sense across all those channels in a consistent way? And probably for most of us, that's where we've worked predominantly for the last 10 or 15 years, is trying to get in this space Drupal out to as big an audience as we can. How does it interact with our other channels? How do we make it part of it, part of what your customers want to achieve? But now I guess we're in the AI age. We've already seen a few talks this morning about AI and how it's impacting. The talk on RAG search was really interesting. We've been implementing RAG search for a few clients and getting it out there in real world usage, which is fun, because how do you get government to trust that you're providing the right information to people when you're providing it in context from an LLM every time you do a query? It gives them something different. And government's very, very hesitant around that as well. But we have some examples of how that can work and things as well. So at the moment, there's obviously a fundamental shift in that, and a lot of the businesses that exist today probably won't exist in 5 or 10 years down the track. We're already talking the speed at which you can develop things and the speed at which you can change and interact with the market is amazingly quick. So things that used to take months take weeks, days. And so that is a fundamental shift in the approach to digital and technology. And so how does that impact across government? So in terms of where, I guess, Drupal sits and the overall stack of things that you need to consider, when a lot of people, when they're thinking about doing AI, are thinking about doing it in a way where it's bolt-on. So you effectively add AI onto your existing process, where you talk about, oh, we've got a business process that doesn't work particularly well. We've built an agent to speed it up. And that's probably the wrong way to think about AI. Like, in reality, that's not going to get you the huge efficiencies we're talking about, the step change that we need from AI. what we really need to think about as a community, I guess, is about how to build in AI, and across, I guess, different areas of effectively the spectrum of things you need to interact with. So in our world, when we think about AI and we think about how Drupal might fit into AI, we think about a huge range of different things. So when we're developing a project, we think about the customer experience or user experience, what happens in that space, making personalised journeys and things that we've been doing for years, but also how do you interact with the AI and LLMs that interact with your sites, what agents are required as part of your process, what your workforce looks like. How do you change and develop your workforce to match what your new business process is going to be? And this is probably a much broader topic than you'd normally find in a tech talk at a Drupal conference. A lot of the times we're very focused on, Drupal is solving a particular problem. But if you're implementing Drupal in a big organisation, what actually happens is there's a huge amount of change management and workforce management change that needs to happen around that as well. And that's a huge consideration when you're looking at a larger scale project. Redesigning your processes is fundamental. You can't just pick up and lift what you've got at the moment. You have to fundamentally, completely redesign what you're thinking about in terms of the interactions that people will have with your service. In reality, they may not visit your website to do a particular thing. They may be just interacting with an agent that's operating somewhere else, and all you'll be doing is serving up content to them or providing a channel whereby they can complete a process or complete a form or something without necessarily directly interacting with your website. You also have to interact with the technology stack that's beyond Drupal. A lot of the times we work in silos and you kind of produce something that works in isolation, but tech doesn't work like that anymore. Like, everything that you do has to interact with a whole range of other things as well. A big thing around implementation of any project, particularly large-scale projects at the moment, is the responsibility and governance aspects of it as well. I work with some of the biggest clients in Australia. When they come to us and say, we want to implement a new solution, one of the biggest things they're looking for is around trust. So they're not just considering what the tech solution is. And we might say open source is amazing, it does all these amazing things, but how do we prove that to government and say, well, you can trust that this product will do what it says on the box, and you'll be able to trust to make sure that your data doesn't leak, that there's no problems with it as well. And this is, I think, an area where Drupal and the open source community in general needs to develop and uplift its skills. When you're talking to executives, they don't really care what the product does. They don't even care that you've got a fancy module that does X, Y, and Z. They don't care that you've got a RAG search or anything like that. What they want to know is that will it work every single time? Will it work when there's a DNS attack happening? Will it work when I've got a whole bunch of sensitive health information in there? How can I be sure that that's not going to get released publicly? And to make sure that's happening, you have to build a trust around what the product is and how that works. And the other thing is the strategic value of what you're developing or what you're building. There's a huge gap, I think, in the open source community around actually delivering on value to what the end user wants. So how do you demonstrate and articulate what the investment is that you're making and what the return will be? And a lot of times in government services, it might be that, it's more efficient, but in actuality, if you can make 1,000 people interact online or interact through a chatbot instead of interacting with a call centre, you can demonstrate that value as an actual KPI. You can show that we're saving money. The conversations about procurement this morning with the keynote were really interesting as well. Like, procurement goes and spends 12 months doing a procurement exercise to do a 2-month project. How do we make that faster, and how do we ensure that those teams understand that the world is moving quicker? And I think it's important then that they have trust and they have a process around how they deliver and work at scale to make these. So I guess that's a little bit of context around AI and what's going on. So apologies to any Star Wars fans for what follows. This is a really bad hacked version using AI of a problem. So a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, a government department wanted to build a new website. The website had to have lots and lots of fancy features. So it's not just an informational site. It had to have interactive elements like maps. It had to have e-commerce. It had to have integrations into their back-end systems. It had to have a fancy new interface that made AI work. It had to have calculators. It had to have a shop where you could go and buy cool t-shirts and tote bags. And of course, all this has been promised in the next 3 months. And the Minister has been committed to making sure this is happening. And the reason we're doing it is to save the summer platypus. And the summer platypus is a rare creature. we'll get to meet throughout this journey. Now, this is a typical project because it's got lots of things going on, and it's lots of interactive elements, lots of things that can happen. And here's our summer platypus. So what you need to do, I guess, thinking about this is the kind of high-level scope, and this is the kind of, I guess, brief we get told all the time in this world is, how do you make this thing happen? And we've only got a few months to do it. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of pressure. There's lots of things you have to make. There's lots of interactions you have to do. There's applications, there's back-end processing, there's mapping, there's commerce, there's everything under the sun that you can think of. And that's a typical kind of large-scale project that we might get involved in. So, to save the little platypus who's in Star Wars land for some reason, I still don't understand, but there's lots of other things that are happening as well. When you think about a project, often people think about it in isolation, in that we've been asked to solve a particular problem. But what is actually happening behind the scenes? And if you go and, I guess, speak to executives about what's going on in their world, like if you're working in a situation where you're trying to save a particular creature using some digital technology to do all kinds of fun things, what's actually happening is behind the scenes. There's Ministry of Government changes, there's planning approvals in place for, habitat changes around where the animals live. There's content required across lots and lots of tiers of government. There's lots of things that are happening around the context of what is your particular project at the time as well. There's also a lot of tech constraints when you go into these kinds of things. In a big enterprise particular project, you might find out they're already using a particular ERP system you have to interact with. They're already using a workflow tool, delivery tool that you have to interact with. They've already got e-commerce up and running. So how do you make your particular solution work for all that? And I think to do that, you have to kind of work in a way where you consider all those layers that I showed before. All the things that you have to interact and engage with have to be considered as part of your project. And it's not enough just to go in and say, oh, we'll build you a site that just does one thing. So in terms of the ways you might want to approach this, here's our typical tech approach is we get a bunch of smart tech people in the room and we say, yeah, we're going to smash this out. We've got 3 months. We're going to build everything. We know what we can do. We know how to make it work. I'll get my best tech architect. I'll get my best 3 devs who are going to smash it out. I can use all the AI tools we've seen. I can make this happen, and I can go off and build my digital tool that will save the summer platypus and make us all happy, I guess. The problem in some ways with this is that it doesn't consider the bigger picture. Often what you're doing is you don't have a true understanding of what the requirements are. You don't understand what the problem is you're trying to solve. You don't understand what the constraints are within the business that you're dealing with. When you're dealing with organisations that have 30,000, 50,000 employees, the challenge is often a lot more around the people side than it is around the technology. Now, you could go and build all this stuff in a few months. I don't have any doubt that there's a lot of people in this room who could make a fully featured Drupal site that has all these interactions with it in a few months. But what's missing is that where's the trust and the approach that delivers for a large-scale organisation? And those organisations need surety that the thing is going to be tested. They need surety that it's going to interact correctly with their e-commerce system. They need surety that you're not going to, the sensitive data that people are submitting through the forms isn't going to end up in it online somewhere else as well. And so there's a whole range of other things that come into it at that point. So I guess in the last few years, a lot of times we've been brought in to help with projects like this. They've kind of done this. We've had this approach. We've built something in 3 months. It doesn't really work properly. We don't really understand what happened and why. And so there has to be an alternative approach. And I think the one thing you need to think about when you're starting with a big organisation and a big scale project, particularly with large scale government and things, is to think about the context and develop a considered approach and pause and plan before you go off and build anything like crazy. I definitely think that you have to consider the full stack of things that are going on across the organisation. You have to consider governance, you have to consider risk, you have to consider cyber, you have to consider all those other bits and pieces that often don't come into our tech projects when you're starting with a big organisation. Because if you don't, the project will fall over before it even gets started. I'm doing projects at the moment where people say, why does it cost $10 million to do this project? You've only got 2 or 3 developers working on it. It's 2 or 3 developers working on it for a few months, yes. But the client is asking us to do 6 months worth of governance and paperwork to get to the point where we can even release the product at the end of the day. So it's a real challenge, not technically about what's happening, but what's happening within the organisation and how do you make that work. So I think when you're dealing with big organisations and when you're dealing with scale of what you're trying to deliver, you have to consider that much broader and bigger context around what's happening. So I really feel like there's a kind of a view that in the technology community that we can go and solve everything with tech, which we can. But you have to consider the much bigger picture when you're dealing with big organisations. If you want to go and do a large-scale project, don't just think about the tech. Think about the impact across everything else that's happening. And a lot of times, politics plays a huge part in these places. If you're dealing with a big department and they want to get something live, there might be 10 or 15 different executives you have to deal with to get to the point where they're on board with what the project is and what it's going to deliver and things as well. And that's a challenge in and of itself. So I think you need to really consider and deliver an approach that considers all those things and gets to that point. So how do you actually do that? I think in reality, you've got to think about your teaming. So up front, when you're delivering a team to do this work, you really need to think about providing people that effectively cover off all the aspects of what you're building. So that might include teams in customer experience and development, agents. Like these days, how are you going to leverage agents? What are the processes that are going to be part of your agent ecosystem that's going to make it work? What is your workforce going to look like that's going to deliver this project in the future? If you're implementing a system like this online tool that's going to save the summer platypus, what is the workforce needed to run and operationalise all that? How do you deal with all the requests you're getting through the back end, all the forms you're getting? How do you deal with the content production and data you need to deal with multilingual across lots of different jurisdictions and things like that? There's a lot of complexity in managing the workforce and setting that up to make it work. What is the business process that's going to change? If it's a new thing completely from scratch, how are you going to interact with it to make it improve and grow? Also, technology, when you think about technology, what can we leverage from AI and what can we leverage from modern architecture to make it simple and easy to interact? We also don't want to be stuck with things that you can't change over time. Even though I work for a big organisation, I don't particularly love the big SaaS vendors and things like that. They get you stuck in and locked in with what's going on. So there's got to be some flexibility and fluidity when you design your architecture. Also understanding the responsibilities about what you're delivering. So you need a team that actually deals with trust and governance and things like that. How do you go through your change advisory boards? How do you go through your cyber approvals? How do you go through, in Australian government, you might be going through IRAP. If it's an international organisation like a major bank or something like that, they have a huge amount of controls over how you get releases done and things like that as well. So there's a lot to be said about managing a project across those things. And finally, and certainly not least of all, what is the strategic value in what you're delivering? So when you're dealing with a project like this, throughout the life cycle of it, how do you demonstrate that the strategy has been met and that when you go back to your exec, because I have projects where you go and see the exec, you might only see them once every 3 months at a steerco, and you say, it's in 3 months, what has happened? What is the value of what we've delivered? Yeah, we've spent $5 million, but what are we actually getting out of that? And you have to articulate and explain what is happening in that project to get to that point and things. And it's often not the tech, it's often about, we achieved this, we solved this risk, or we delivered something that proves that the thing works for a certain user type and things like that. So, bringing it, I guess, back to all for Drupal in a sense, how do you make Drupal as part of this? I don't think there's any risk in the next 5 to 10 years that we're going to see the end of projects that require Drupal. And in fact, I see a real upside in what Drupal can do. The big SaaS vendors are really struggling at the moment with the idea that their lunch is being cut by AI, whereas open source won't necessarily have that same problem. People will be looking for quick and easy ways to get to market with a consolidated, trusted platform. So you say, if you're going to save your summer platypus, you potentially can use it as the kind of source in the middle of all these things that are going on. So you use it for content development, and I've got some examples of how you might do that. You use it for multilingual publishing. You use it for public user workflows and forms. You use it as a repository. We were talking about RAG search before, for your chatbot, for your interactivity at that point. And you use it as a process for capturing data, and you use it as a way to securely manage and provide a trusted place where you can manage and maintain your content. And you use it from the legacy Gen 2 of digital transformation, you use it as a way to push into your other channels, which will include AI and digital from that point. What is it not for? Don't get Drupal to do everything under the sun either. A lot of times I see projects where people are trying to make it do everything that it shouldn't be doing as well. The open source community seems to love building modules for doing everything under the sun. Why? Why would you spend weeks and months trying to build something that already exists, or it does 98% of what you want? Go and use that. Go and talk to the business about changing the process a little bit to use something that's already in market and things as well. The other thing that I've seen happen a lot is people seem to start trying to use Drupal as like a workflow engine and things like that. Like, you get yourself into a lot of trouble if you... So I'd suggest use it for what it's designed for and make it the core of your kind of digital publishing and management, but not for everything else that we're talking about today. So what you could do in 3 months is very much a discovery activity to understand what the true requirements are, an MVP launch, deliver key functionality that meets users' needs, information first, provide progressive disclosure. So a lot of time when we're doing big launches and big projects, you might do very staggered and staged releases that provide functionality that's critical to the users at the time and provide much more interactive things over time. And don't forget doing your cyber testing and everything up front. A lot of times we've gone into organisations and we do some reviews around things that have happened, and you find out that actually no one did a pen test on the site. No one actually went through the process of checking that everything was secure, and that's caused lots of dramas for lots of big departments over time. And that's when they really get worried. So I guess making sure you're doing those things up front before you launch what it is. What happens then? The Death Star gets blown up, the Sum of Platypus is saved, and yeah. So why does this matter? Because core digital technology isn't going anywhere. You're still going to have a platform at the centre of what you're doing. It's still required for trust and confidence. It's still required as a mechanism to manage and maintain content. What the future looks like is probably how you're going to interact with AI. The LLMs are all pretty cagey around how they get content into them and what the process is to kind of uplift it. AI optimization and things is a dark art at the moment, and will only remain so probably because the LLMs aren't going to publicly release how they interact with your content and use it. The speed of change is definitely baking traditional models, and probably the model where you just have a dev team working on things needs rethinking, because you're going to need a whole bunch of those other things I talked about earlier. You're also going to need flatter structures and faster implementation, because people are expecting it quicker. Even in big business, they're expecting us now to say, well, how quickly can you build prototypes? How much efficiency can you save? On some of the biggest contracts we have, we've been asked to deliver 25% year-on-year efficiencies around how we're using AI and things. So there's absolutely, we have to be able to demonstrate what we're using AI for on big projects and things as well. So, and this is just a little video that kind of shows some of the stuff I'm talking about. Like, when you're talking about using Drupal as a content repository, one of the things that you could have is this thing. Like, this is some technology we built in the US that shows for one of the big media companies that shows using AI to generate videos on the fly. And in this case, with Friends, what they did was go through all of the Friends library and tag it using AI. So the whole repository is completely tagged and available for someone to go through and connect. So you can go and query, say, give me a query about Joey when he's unhappy or something, and it will search every single video of Friends and pull it back, and then you can use that to create snippets of content and things that you'll publish. So, you know, that's how you can use AI at a very, very big scale in a massive media organisation to make it efficient for them to produce content and make it efficient for them to go and search and enable what they're doing as well. So we did it. We saved the Sum of Platypus. I think I've made it on time, but I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah. Oh.
How are you approaching head-hours-based pricing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. All of the big consultancies have traditionally priced on a headcount type model, T&M almost internally, even if the price to the client is price. We're much more moving to value-based pricing, so figuring out what the value is of what we can deliver. So in a project that might have taken 6 months previously, yeah, it would be X number of people working on it for 6 months would cost this much, and we'd work a margin out on that. Most of the time now, what we're doing is saying, well, what is the client value that they're going to get out of this, and what is our delivery cost to meet that? And in 6 months now, you can produce anything. Like we've seen examples today of stuff that you can build in a few weeks that are incredible, right? So some of those things, it's not so much about what you can deliver versus how much time, it's what is the value to the client. So in government, that's a tough one because government's still pretty slow moving on this. In the corporate world, they very much moved to the model where what am I getting and how quickly can you deliver it? And you can say to them, well, the value is this. In insurance, at the moment we're doing an exercise with a big insurance company to say, well, how do we deliver more insurance products into market? How do we get more sales through? And we can demonstrate that and say, well, if we deliver this value to you, our price will change and we'll receive more benefit if we can actually get value out of it as well. So the commercial models are changing at the Big Four, although very slowly, I would argue. So, but lots in that.
Great talk. I have, I guess, what I'll call that one quick and then an actual question. Very excited. So for government, how do you deal with PDFs? In general, like in process, I found government usually non-negotiable.
Yeah.
How do you kind of work around situations? Project, library, no way. What your really?
I think what I spend a lot of time doing these days is building proof of concepts that show how you might get around that problem. So in your example of 10,000 PDF documents and what you might do with them, at the moment I've got teams building ingestion tools and we're using them in production as well to go and take 10,000 documents, actually 10 million or 10 billion documents at the moment even. How quickly can we ingest those documents into a repository where we can actually use and interact with them? So PDFs are notoriously bad, but that problem's been solved. Like I can get 10,000 PDFs into a structured data schema within a few days with AI and getting to that point. And I think showing the client that, going to them and saying, hey guys, here's what you could do, here's what you could have. Once they see it and interact with it, they go, oh, that's great. We want you to do that properly. We want to do it in production. And then the PDF problem goes away in a sense because you've got it in a situation where you've got it in a repository. You're doing something with it at that point. And you can use all the other tools from there to interact with it.
To the material, you mentioned in there 25%. How are you demonstrating? We're trying to work out.
Yeah.
Work out. How are you?
So two halves to that equation, I guess. One is the cost, effectively. So in those kind of big examples, we have a cost. We still have a cost per person on that, but we have to reduce that. It's written into the contract that we have to reduce our cost per person. So we have to show that we're getting more efficient in delivering that. And the other side in that example is the bulk categorization of tickets, like how much work are we getting through and how can we prove and show that's actually happening as well. So how much development is being done, how many test cases are run, how much of it is now automated compared to what it was. So we have some hard metrics around some of those things to show what they are. And it's when you're negotiating a contract like that, it's interesting because we want to be kind of as specific as we can about what we can and can't do. We don't want lots of grey area and stuff. So we've been very clear about, we can demonstrate this one. We can show that we're doing more test cases and we can show we can drop the number of engineers we've got working from 50 down to 40 next year by using AI tools, and we can prove that in the contract. So we've got some of those very specific things written in the contract that we've thought about how to make. Cool. Thanks, guys.